Hello folks, and welcome to this comparative analysis of two wonderful digital piano actions. The TP400 in this Numa X Piano GT and the Grand Touch S in this Yamaha P525. Now what you heard at the beginning was an arrangement I had done, a short excerpt, where I was using the P525 action to control the VI Labs Modern D. And I chose that little arrangement because I threw some single key repetitions in there, which I think is the biggest difference between these two actions. Now, before we talk about the differences, let me talk some about the similarities. The TP400 is Studio Logic's top-of-the-line action. It's mostly made out of plastic, but it has wood veneers on the white keys. And it is good quality, very robust action. It's made on a rigid metal frame. I've been banging away on this action for over a year and a half, and the keys feel just as good as they did on day one. There's no additional lateral play in the keys. They're not making any clicking noises. This action is definitely built to last. The Grand Touch S action in this Yamaha P525 is not Yamaha's top-of-the-line action, but it's built around the same design as the top-of-the-line Grand Touch action. It's just a shortened version of it. That's what the S stands for. And it doesn't have the counterweights in it. But it feels very good, very solid out of the box. I can't attest to the longevity of it because I've only had it a few weeks. But the white keys are actually made with a solid wood core that has plastic sandwiched both the top and the bottom on it. The black keys are all plastic. But both of these actions feel very good. They don't feel cheap at all. They feel top of the line. And when you do some static up and down weight tests on it, you find that there's some striking similarities between these two actions. When we start to consider the mechanical differences between these two actions, you're going to find that they're so similar, it's really going to boil down to personal preference as to which you prefer. For example, the black keys on the TP400 have a static down weight that's a little heavier than the white keys. The black keys on the Grand Touch S action have a static down weight that's a little bit lighter than the white keys. So it's just the opposite, isn't it? Let me just run down some of the numbers very quickly here so you can see what we're dealing with. The static down weight on the white keys on the TP400 from the bass to treble go from about 77 grams to 67 grams. On the Grand Touch S action, from bass to treble, it goes from about 80 grams to 70 grams. So you're only talking like, what, a 3-gram difference, right? The black keys on the TP400 go from about 80 grams down to 75 grams. And on the Grand Touch S action, they go from 70 grams to 60 grams. So that's really where your biggest difference lies between these two actions. It really is in the weight of the black keys. The up weight on the TP400 action goes from about 45 grams to 35 grams, where on the Grand Touch S action, it goes from 40 grams to 30 grams. So those are the measurements. And to me, as I play these, the mechanical feel and response I get, my brain tells me that the TP400 is a tad bit lighter to the touch and a little quicker in the key response as well, but not by much. And that's what the numbers tell me as well. But they're very similar, and it really is going to be dependent upon your personal preference as to which you like best. Now that we've talked about the similarities between these two actions, let's cover some of the differences. And I think the biggest difference is in the single key repetition speed. Now let me put this in the context of an acoustic grand piano action, because piano manufacturers are always advertising that their actions are similar to acoustic grand piano actions. Well, here's an acoustic grand piano that I play on a regular basis. It's a mid-sized Yamaha acoustic grand piano. And the key dip on this action, the distance the key travels from top to bottom is about 10 millimeters. And if you want to repeat a note, you got to lift that key from the key bed about 2.3 millimeters to give enough room for the jack to slip back under the knuckle, and then you can repeat a note. Now, the fastest I could repeat notes with one hand on this acoustic grand piano action is about 10 notes per second. Take a look. The key dip on the Grand Touch S action is a little bit more at 11 millimeters, and you have to raise the key slightly more to approximately 3 millimeters before you can repeat a note. And while it's not as easy to repeat notes on the Grand Touch S action as it is on the acoustic piano, it doesn't affect the performance. I can still get the same amount of repetitions per second on this as I can on the acoustic, approximately 10. Have a listen. The key dip and the distance to repeat a note on this TP400 action is the same as the Grand Touch S action at 11 millimeters and 3 millimeters approximately. However, I'm unable to perform at the same rate on this TP400 action. Have a listen. Now, as you can see, I'm dropping notes there. It doesn't sound as smooth, and there's really no way I can get the same performance out of this TP400 action as I can out of the Grand Touch S and out of the acoustic piano. If I want to do fast repeated notes, I have to actually slow it down considerably. Now, why is that if mechanically these actions are so similar? I mean, they have the same key dip, the same distance to repeat a note. Well, this illustrates a very important point when we're considering digital piano actions. The mechanical function of the action and how it feels is only half the equation. The other half is how the software, the sensors and software interacts with that mechanical function. So yes, well, both keyboards will repeat a note at 3 millimeters. The big difference is at 3 millimeters, when you raise the TP400 action up to 3 millimeters and you go to repeat a note, it gives you a fixed MIDI value of 4. No matter how soft or how hard you press that key, it's baked into the software that you're only going to get a MIDI value of 4. And that's a pretty silent note. And as a matter of fact, if you want to get anything above 4, you got to raise the key about 5 millimeters or more, 5.5 millimeters, to start getting usable MIDI values. So you actually have to move this key almost double the distance to get the same performance as you get out of the Grand Touch S action. And this is not the way an acoustic piano action works. I'm going to give you a little illustration here. On the acoustic piano, I put a little red mark next to a key, and the adjacent key I'm going to move up and down. I'm going to repeat a couple notes, and I'm only going to raise it up to the red mark, which signifies where that key resets at, where the reset point is, where the jack slips under the knuckle and you can start repeating notes. And I'm going to go lighter to louder, just a few notes, so you can see that at the point where you can repeat a note just at the jack or above the jack, you can get variable dynamics. You can get really soft to a little bit louder. Take a look. Now that little red line on the acoustic piano was at 3 millimeters, which would be on that piano considered playing just barely above the jack, because you remember that piano reset at, I think, 2.3 millimeters. But you can see, playing just above the jack, you can get a variable dynamic out of it, from soft to louder. And if I did that same example on the Grand Touch S action, and I put a little red mark exactly where this key can repeat at 3 millimeters, which was the same distance I was playing on that acoustic, you can get variable dynamics out of this as well. At the minimum distance of 3 millimeters, when this key can repeat, I can get down to 1 or 2 MIDI values, or I can get up to 50. I can get a variable dynamic out of it, just like the acoustic piano. But if I did that same illustration on the TP400 and put that red mark where this key can repeat at 3 millimeters, where I was playing on the acoustic piano, you would just get a fixed MIDI value of 4 and nothing more than that. As a matter of fact, to get anything more, like I said earlier, you'd have to raise the key up to about 5 to 5.5 millimeters to start to get a usable MIDI value. And what this ends up doing is it creates a kind of a dead spot at that 3 millimeter distance where you would expect the key to repeat. And you can really notice this. Let me give you just one more example, and then we'll move on, I promise. But if you do single note repetitions with 2 hands, just for illustrative purposes, you can really see what I'm talking about. Because with 2 hands, you can get a very consistent, smooth, a sustained repetition going. And what I'm going to do here first on the Grand Touch S action is I'm going to get that repeated note going, and I'm going to hover right at 3 millimeters, the minimum distance to repeat a note. And you're going to see how effortlessly I can keep a note repeated and how evenly sustained it is and how easy it is to keep it going. Have a listen. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing on the TP400 action, and you're going to see that it's more difficult to get that repeated, consistent, sustained repetition going with two hands because you can't hover at 3 millimeters. You actually have to raise the key to 5 or more millimeters, and what ends up happening is you get, because you're moving the key so much more, you get loud notes in there, or sometimes you get too close to that 3 millimeter mark and you end up dropping notes in that kind of dead zone. It just doesn't sound as good, or it's not as easy for me to do. Have a listen. So it is more difficult to perform single note repetitions on the TP400 as it is compared to the Grand Touch S action, because you have to move the keys almost double the distance, the white keys, to get the same function. And I should point out this mostly affects the white keys on the TP400, because on the black keys the key dip is a little bit shallower and the distance to repeat a note is a little bit less as well. So that problem really doesn't manifest so much on the black keys as it does on the white keys, but it definitely is objectively harder. Now, the degree of difficulty really is relevant to the skill of the pianist that's using the action. There might be some pianists who have no problem performing single note repetitions on the TP400 just as easily as they do on an acoustic piano or on the Grand Touch S action. I'm just saying I can't do it. I can't perform single note repetitions as quickly and easily as I can on this action compared to the Grand Touch S and the acoustic action. And I notified Studio Logic of my experience, and Studio Logic is a great company. I wouldn't be surprised if they come out with a firmware update in the future that enables you to get variable MIDI velocities at that 3 millimeter mark. You know, regardless of skill level, I would imagine most pianists would prefer an action that's easier to play over one that's more difficult to play. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're always working to improve Studio Logic, their action, and if they come out with a firmware update. So in conclusion, let me just highlight two more differences that I think are kind of relevant as well when looking at these actions. Number one is the simulated escapement. The P525 does a fantastic job. It's just the way you would expect it to be, like on an acoustic piano. You can push to the escapement through it, trigger a note on both the white and the black keys. Not so much on the TP400. You can do that on the black keys, but on the white keys it would trigger a note just before the escapement, which is counterintuitive to it even being a simulation. So that's something interesting. And I thought also too, I heard a rumor that the new MK2 MIDI controller coming out by Studio Logic, the MK2 GT MIDI controller, I heard the rumor that it's not going to have simulated escapement, and that's probably a good thing. The other thing I want to mention too, difference between these two, is the way they handle the MIDI output. You know, the Yamaha P525 uses high resolution MIDI, but you cannot get the full spectrum regardless of what touch sensitivity setting you use. You can put it on the lightest touch sensitivity and you're still not going to get to 127. I mean, if you pound this keyboard to the point where you might break it, you might get to 120, but you're not going to get to 127. About 105 to 110 is the range that I could get with normal playing wailing on it. So even though it's high resolution, if you're only getting to 110.999, you're still not getting the full spectrum. The only way you can get the full spectrum with this is if you use a touch curve, some sort of touch curve editor, and you can compress the range a little bit, and you can then get the full spectrum. The TP400 gives you 0 to 127 right from the get-go. It's wonderful. And it's actually a little bit easier to get the lower MIDI values when you're playing this action compared to the Grand Touch S action. And not only that, with the TP400 you have a ton of control over how you adjust the touch sensitivity. You can do it for each key, white and black. You can do the ratio between the white and black. So it really gives you a lot of flexibility. So as a MIDI controller, it's a little bit better in my opinion. And one last thing too, when I did test the dynamic weight of these keys, the touch weight, 240 grams, both produced around 64 MIDI values. So even the touch weight is very similar on these two actions. So overall, I like the feel of the TP400 action, but I like the performance of the Grand Touch S action. I might not use single note repetitions a lot in the music that I play, but I like the idea of knowing I can when I want to. It's available if I need it. So for that reason, I'm going to be hanging on to this P525, and I'm going to be putting up my Numa X Piano GT for sale. But I am looking forward to trying out the Studio Logic MK2 GT MIDI controller when it comes out, because I just believe that Studio Logic's such a great company. I wouldn't be surprised if they actually do improve this one area, and then you're going to have an awesome controller, an awesome keyboard that's going to perform great. So this is the differences that I've seen between these two actions, and these are my observations. Hopefully you found it interesting, and if you're an analytical person like I am and you want to know why things work the way they do, perhaps this gave you a little bit deeper insight into the differences between these two actions and digital pianos kind of in general. So again, I want to thank you for watching and joining me on this journey, and continue playing, enjoying making music, and God bless.